And so we'll get right into it. And if you've been on the series, you know that this is kind of my standard boilerplate start. Again, Adam Rose, 14 or so years as a consultant of different sizes in the Texas Southwest area. Currently a sanitary product manager, and I update this throughout each one. We're dangerously close to having our third child, because I'm the kind of person that does the math. That is the accurate decimal right now. We currently live in Portland, but our transplant's from Texas, and we were told you cannot use umbrellas if you're in Portland because it looks like you're not from there. So there's my kids with their eco umbrellas near the house. So, okay, so, and you knew this anyway, but so our series of 5 topics, we are on number 3. We went through a overall introduction, then we hit wet weather, and calibration is today. So like Nicole said, if you want calibration in the right spot. We've got 2 more lined up. Pumps still has an exclamation mark on there, and then validation. Validation is kind of a grab bag, so I've been having this here, and we've been getting some comments. By all means, comment, because we can throw that into that last webinar just to cover any other topics that are of interest to the sanitary sewer modeler. So let's review. So there's a copy of the first presentation Nicole mentioned, and the second one, and if you're good at extrapolation, you could probably infer what the third one might be. So feel free to write those down. Major comments from the last one, which covered just more specifically wet weather. It wasn't really this cut and dry, but we had a lot of, I prefer to use this method, it's a good method, and I don't use this one, and then someone else will say the exact opposite thing, which is what we'd expect and kind of what we covered in the presentation, that different methods apply different places. The biggest comment, though, that I got is, how have you made it through 2 webinars without showing me any real examples? I want to see some real examples of how to do some of this stuff. So you're in luck, because I've made up for it by having 3 examples in this webinar. So here's the agenda for calibration. We'll start. I'm not going to give you the examples up front. You're going to have to suffer through definitions of calibration as well as kind of goals and scope of calibration, but I promise you it will help you throughout the project. Then we will get into the different methods and examples of those methods. Time being available, we'll go to a summary and then Q&A, although like Nicole mentioned, Q&A is kind of occurring behind the scenes. I'm blissfully unaware of it as it's happening now. If there's anything left over, that's where I'll jump in at the end. There's another link here to a post I did on calibration if you're just really interested in it. It covers some of the other lesser known, lesser used ways of calibrating or validating a model, and it can be useful if you're trying to explain that to someone in your organization or in your circle of peers who maybe doesn't have to handle models and or calibration that often. Okay, so let's start with defining what we mean by calibration, because that's important. We need to be able to start somewhere before we move forward. I like to start with more official definitions. So this is a US EPA definition, a partial definition, but you say a model calibration is an initial testing of a model and tuning it to reflect a set of field data. And I like that. That's pretty, I mean, it's cut and dry, but it's a pretty good explanation of what I would say calibration is. So if I try to take that and kind of own that a little bit myself, whenever I started calibrating models, and I've done it, for a long time, I always kind of start with this lofty goal of matching my model, right? Which quickly after I looked at data or looked at anything else, reverted to comparing reasonably well, right? So matching isn't going to happen. And we'll cover how that's really not even something that you practically want to do. But what are we going to compare it with? And I've thought of a few here. Sometimes people compare it with another model, or a different method, or like your gut or intuition, or actual data, or maybe someone else's gut or intuition, like a field staff. So, but I thought that's just my idea, so I'm going to try to launch that same question to you. So if you have access and fingers, you should be able to vote the same thing. So do you use, and you can vote more than once. So, and there are definitely projects, as you probably know. If you are updating someone else's work from, say, a master plan update, you by definition most likely have another model. So you have something against which to compare. And this isn't also what you think the right answer should be. I'm more interested in what you actually do. I don't judge too much. All right. If you're on the fence about it, you got about 3 seconds before I close it. All right, I close it, and I will show you the results, which is good because I kind of hedged my bet there, and I am going to hide it and show you that, of course, ideally actual data is what you want to use. All right, well, oftentimes see people who only have another model, and so that's kind of an abstraction compared against an abstraction, which is a fun exercise, but not as valid as you'd like. So what we're saying here is basically the same thing the EPA said, which is I want to compare reasonably well with actual data. All right, well, that's not really a definition per se. Let's dive a little deeper in how we can take that and develop goals and a scope against it. So same sentence as before, compare reasonably well with actual data. Well, there's two pieces to that, right? There's actual data. Well, what do I mean when I say actual data? And this is important because I think a lot of times people jump right into trying to finish the jigsaw puzzle without really defining what they're trying to do. So consider that the quality of your actual data, right? So if you're using a metering vendor who has a stated accuracy of 5%, then I would submit to you that trying to calibrate to less than the stated accuracy of that single meter is a little foolish and a little not worth your time. So that's one example, the quality of the actual data itself. And again, remember that for a lot of times, and this is kind of the second point is relevance, a lot of times the actual data isn't directly collected. So I say relevance both from the aspect of most flow meters are measuring average velocity and depth and estimating what the flow is. So it's kind of one level removed from the actual measured object. There's also relevance in so much as no matter how much money you've got in time, and we could all use a little more of that, you only have a finite number of meters and gauges, so you're always having some level of extrapolation and relevance. So if you're looking at a meter 1,000 feet downstream in your model, you need to take that into consideration. And then quantity, both from the sheer number of meters as well as the quantity of data. So while we'd all like to have multiple years of 15-minute increment data, that's just typically not practical. So if you've got even, say, a 3-month cycle and it happens to be in a wet time of season, wherever that is for you, well, of course, the dry weather and the average daily flows aren't really accurate on an overall basis. Now, that may be fine, right? Hopefully, you've used your intuition and your gut and you've come up with the best possible way in time to collect that data. But it's just things to consider. So the other aspect of that is, what do I mean with reasonably well? Because actual data, at least it's quantifiable. Reasonably well, that's a really weak, qualified statement. So let's just break it up into two pieces, right? So one thing we want is validation, and I'd submit that's the first thing you want to do is just make sure that your model is valid at all, and then get into calibration. All right, so what do I mean by validation? So I'm going to simplify that and say, in my mind, validation is just kind of a high level and or short duration initial sanity check. So for example, if I have actual data or not, whatever data I'm using, if I execute my model the first time, it's initial foray into the world, and it shows that I have a certain junction that overflows every day or every week in the middle of July when it's nice and hot. Unless I know that I'm overflowing sanitary sewage every single day at that junction, it's probably not accurate, right? And it doesn't have to be that obvious. Perhaps it's showing a pipe to be surcharged all the time, and you know through manhole inspections that pipe's never surcharged. There's just ways to know that this model may not be right. There may be something more fundamentally wrong. It may be model connectivity, perhaps your inverts aren't in there correctly, something major, and you really don't want to dive down into micro-optimizing a calibration if you don't have your validation correct. So on the aspect of calibration, I'll give you my theoretical definition. So to me, it's a function, and we're trying to minimize this function, and the function has inputs of money both from a project as well as trickling down to flow monitoring or data collection. We're all on board with getting actual data. With time, again, they're related on how much time I have to collect data and or analyze it, the data itself, and the error. So that's, again, a theoretical. If you had to press me and just take this for what it's worth, I might say something very rough like maybe I would like, without seeing data, to be plus or minus 5% on dry weather flow and maybe 10% on wet weather flow on both a peak and an average basis. Right? Again, that's just a single data point in a landscape of data points, but that's something that if I was just pressed into it. And I can tell you, sitting on some of the regional and national boards of some of these modeling committees, that we have that same argument both in water and wastewater about trying to come up with a standard. And if you search around, you will find some here and there. But also, if you remember from the last webinar, we can't even really standardize on a wet weather flow method. So if we can't standardize on a method, it's going to be difficult to standardize on how well we can actually represent that method. So just bear that in mind. An example might be something a little more specific now. We'd say, does my system overflow with 2 inches per hour of rain in April 2015, given that the ground is dry? So now we're talking about what we expect to actually happen. And what do we use that for? Well, we use that for extrapolation, which is really the purpose of a model. All this work up to the point of doing extrapolation is just exercise that doesn't really provide a client or a coworker with anything of value per se. There's ancillary value in GIS, things like that the model will produce, but it doesn't really help you answer any questions. So I say extrapolation, I mean both in the spatial extent. So if I have a model and it shows that this area looks pretty good, then I can assume that upstream and downstream of that model in areas that I'm not measuring are probably also pretty accurate, and I can inspect their performance. It also means the additional extrapolation of time, temporal extrapolation. So if I think my 2015 model looks good, and I'm happy with existing conditions, then through magic I can estimate what 2025 may look like. Again, hopefully you're following along with the webinars. We've parameterized everything, really comfortable with extending out our dry weather flow and wet weather, and we see what happens in 10 years, and we can make estimates to meet those demands before they happen. And of course, feel free to still make these better for you. So that's what I say as far as methods. So now we're getting a little bit closer into actually showing you how to do some calibration. So it's pretty basic in my mind. The methods are whatever you can vary. So I'm going to do 3, just telling you now. The first one is wet weather specific, and it's hydrology, right? Which stands to reason. If the fact that rain falls out of the sky is what makes your sewer behave a certain way, then directly characterizing it through hydrology is a pretty smart way to do a calibration. Second one is RTK. So RTK is also related to rainfall, but it is a set of estimates that are a little more parameterized than some of the hydrology methods. And then the third one being flow. So RTK is also wet weather only. We'll talk about that. The third one being flow, both flow from wet weather and dry weather. So if you recall, we had a poll in the last webinar, and the question was, what methods do you use for wet weather? Again, specifically wet weather. Here's the results if you don't remember. And so again, those happen to line up with the top 3 results. So trying to stay true to those. So how are we going to approach these methods? Again, this is all the lead up to doing the work. And this is a quote, it's a 3-part quote that I really like and I use often. So if you've heard anything I've done before, you may have heard this, and bear with it. So the first part is this: there are known knowns. These are things that we know that we know. So if you get a really good GIS system or you have good metering data, hopefully you know that, right? You expect those, and you're going to use that as your rock to start building your calibration. There are known unknowns. That makes sense, right? There are things that we know we don't know. So on the modeling level, you don't really know what the results are going to be until you start working through it. And on the project level, because the model doesn't live in a vacuum, you also don't know what other issues you might have, even down to personnel workload. So there's just things that you kind of know that you're not going to know. But I would submit to you even further than that, there is this concept of unknown unknowns, which you can thank Donald Rumsfeld for this quote 10 to 15 years ago, which when I first heard it kind of made me insane, but the more I think about it, the more it makes a lot of sense. And that is to say that there are things that we don't even know we don't know yet. And you can do 100 calibration studies and you still aren't going to be able to cover everything. You'll cover a lot more of them, you won't have everything. I mentioned that to say that, again, we're going to try to do our best to erase those unknown unknowns if we can. So the first thing, and the reason we've talked all the way up to this point without showing anything, is the concept of standardization. And that's really documenting the goals and the scope. Now you may say, I have a contract, so I have some level of documentation. And I would say that's good. You probably don't have the right level of documentation in that contract of exactly what you're trying to do, and it doesn't have to be a quantified 5% of average and peak, but exactly what it is you're trying to do is really helpful to have. Otherwise, you kind of have one equation, 2 unknowns by the time you get to the end, and we really are trying to avoid that. The other one is what I'm calling synthesize, which is saying that you should do the validation first. And I'll show you that my first example is that concept of if you don't validate first, you're going to start optimizing on things that are completely not physically relevant. Symmetry, the concept here being if I have a meter shed and it's all 50-year-old ductile iron pipe and I have a certain amount of leakage, I should not apply that leakage to my new section of town that's 20 years old PVC, right? That's not an intuitively thing you can do. But if you do have another section that's 50-year-old ductile iron, perhaps you can, as a first run through, especially if you don't have meter data, apply that. Try to use that to your advantage. Last thing here is simplify is better. You should do dry weather flow before wet weather because it's one less variable, and you should start upstream and move downstream if at all possible, because your upstream impacts affect downstream. So going the other way can lead you on quite a circular path. Okay, 20 minutes or so into it, first flow example. So we're going to start with the simplest one. This one will also cover dry weather. Everything up to this point is kind of inferred wet weather, which is the harder calibration, but certainly you need to have something on the dry weather side. It's a very simple example because I don't want you to start thinking down the road too far. All we're going to try to do in this example is calibrate one junction against one gauge point, and this is just a flow meter. And I say again, this is a simplified example. So let me see if I can run it. There we go. So hopefully you can see XP Swim here is a real simple model. There are two outfalls in this model. Manhole 15 here to the northeast. If you assume that we're looking north, there's another outfall down here. And when I say simple, I mean simple. So you can see the background image is a rug. So I thought if I had a background image of an aerial, you might start thinking, well, what area is the sewer shed? But if I had a background image of a rug, you couldn't really overemphasize the complexity here, right? So we're starting simple. But you can see here, here's our manhole. And so now I'm going to drag over some real data. This is real data, of course, applied to a completely fictitious area. And so this is usually what you get, right? You get some massive amount of data. This is only a few months worth of data, but you know, what you can see here is in the 5 figures of just units of data. We look at that more of a row column. What I usually see is something like a timestamp, a flow, an elevation and or level. It's usually level, and then a velocity. And again, usually this flow is somehow inferred by level and velocity. So that's not really that helpful on a 10,000 data point level. So usually what we'll do is take that and determine a diurnal pattern. So if I go back to all my data, if I just very roughly inspected it, I'd say, well, maybe 0.3 or 0.4 is the average if I just kind of looked at it through all the data. But I don't really care about all the data. I want to know on a daily. So here you can see every hour of the day, just a simple averaging function, what the average data is. So this is an orange, which applies to this orange diurnal pattern here. If you're interested in this spreadsheet, I can give it to you. There's really nothing too magical about it, but if you're concerned about not capturing with your brain what I'm doing, not hard to do. You can see the average here is 0.41. Now, the first mistake I see people do from time to time is they take this, they say, oh, it's a diurnal pattern, it's an hourly pattern. I will apply that pattern to everything in my metering basin, which I would recommend you not do, because again, the average, or the average of this curve is 0.41. So if I apply that to any other node, I'm going to be reducing by roughly 60% the volume. I don't want to do that on a daily basis. I want the average to stay 0.41. I just want it to vary over time. So what you need to do is divide it by the average. So here's my normalized. So now you see the average of this blue line here is actually 1. So if I apply this curve to everything in my meter shed, all I'm doing is changing when on an hourly basis, or if you want to do a different time basis, when I'm applying that. So that's the first thing you want to do, is make that a unitless curve. Second thing I would say is, even though we have 10,000 data points, and if you look at the data points, most of the data points are in this area, you can see there's obviously some rainfall, right? A dozen or so rainfall events that shoot way up over 1. Well, the next thing I see people do is they take all the data. So they get this average of 0.41 and call that the dry weather average. But it's not the dry weather average because it rained during that time. That's the average daily flow. This is a really simplified example. You'll see a little more complex on the next one. But all I did is said, I'm going to set a threshold. So if my average is 0.4 million gallons per day, or 400,000 gallons per day, I'm going to set a threshold of 1 million gallons per day. So if the flow meter registers more than 1 million gallons per day, I'm going to remove a small subset of the flow on either side of that, and I'm going to consider that dry weather. Again, that's simplified, but let's try that. So now I have what I'm calling actual dry weather. Notice the average is slightly less, as you'd imagine. So instead of 0.41, it's 0.39. And again, I can normalize that so that I have something that's over 1. So if I was doing a dry weather initial run for validation, I would be using this number, and I'm applying that everywhere in my meter shed just to validate what's happening. If you can further subdivide that in XP Swim, you can actually break that up per day. Because I don't know about you, but I don't come to the office to use the toilet and shower. I do that at my house. So the weekend and the weekdays are different. My consumption doesn't change appreciably, but where I consume it or use it, changes. So, and as you can see in this example too, it does change. Again, the average is 0.39. That's the dry average. We'd expect it to be the same as the average on an hourly basis. But if I normalize that, you can see that on Wednesday and Thursday, especially Wednesday, there's significantly less flow. So if I really want to do a longer term simulation, not just a day, but a week or several weeks, you might consider breaking it up on also a daily basis. Final thing we'll talk about as we're kind of eating through this data is the actual meter shed itself. In this simplified example, I'm saying it's 129 acres. So 129 acres of actual sewer metered area. Got to be careful there too, because the actual drainage area might be much bigger, but how much of that area is actually directly sewered? It's probably a sub area. In this case, I say 129 acres. So if I make a couple estimates here, these yellow things are estimates, and I say that it's densely residential, so 8 houses per acre, so pretty small houses, and those houses have on average 3.2 people per house. These is just arbitrary numbers, but you can see I get a density of roughly 25 people per acre. So I have 25 people per acre, roughly 130 acres. I know how many people I have. I also know the dry weather flow, so I can estimate a gallons per capita per day. So I've normalized my flow into individual people, and if I know how many people are there, I can apply that. Now, that can be really useful, especially if you've got GIS data like census data. So you can actually do some spatial aggregation and disaggregation of data to help be a little more accurate. This is on the dry weather flow side. Hopefully that all makes sense kind of quick there. So I will show you XP Swim in just a second, but let me show you a graph of kind of what that may look like. There's a lot going on here. But you can see the blue line that's kind of hidden in the back, this nice, beautiful curve, is what I am going to be inputting into the model. The nice, slightly deformed gray curve is what's coming out at the bottom of my sewer basin. And of course, you may say, oh, there's a little difference there, and that difference is through attenuation. So the model is dynamic. So I load this hydrograph in at each individual manhole. It's attenuated as it travels through the system. So there's slight attenuation. This orangish color here is representative of what the day is against which I may be calibrating or validating, so an average day. And then you see this other line that kind of skews up and all over the place. It's just a different day, right? So again, when we get into quantity of data, if you're going to calibrate, you need to calibrate to an event or to a section of events, and so you need to kind of pick that. You, by definition, will be off in other areas, but again, you're trying to minimize your error of that function of error in time, and there are literally dozens of different types of error estimating approaches out there. But that's what we're trying to show, so let's go into the model real quick. So the first example I want to show you is this concept of validation. So in my base scenario, I'm looking at this manhole, and if I look at the results, aha, that doesn't look right at all, does it? Right? We expected something in the neighborhood of 0.4, and here you see something way up in 7 or 8. Well, that's double what we expected. So why is it double? That's a validation issue in my mind. And so in my simplified example, I did something that happens a lot, which is in an area of potentially not the greatest level of as-built, or otherwise there could be lots of reasons. This section of pipe here is incorrectly routed. So this whole drainage area here is routed here, and really what we're going to try is a different option, which is routing it through a different scenario this way. So now these pipes route down to this outfall. That makes sense. Go back to the same one and check it. Aha, much better, right? Same information, but now we're down in the 0.3 and 0.4, so we're getting closer. And to show you what that actually looks like, I'm going to go into a manhole. I'm in hydraulics mode. I'm going to go into dry weather, and I'm going to look at my default dry weather pattern. And here you can see the flow rate. That's the 118 we had before. This area is specific to the drainage, the sewer drainage area of manhole 14, the density of 25.6 we had before. And then if you look at the dry weather flow pattern, look at edit, that's the daily and hourly temporal pattern that we had before. So we kind of stack the cards in our favor by doing the analysis in Excel, getting everything we want, entering it in and running it. Okay, dry weather flow, right? So that's kind of the cooking show version of I just pulled it out of the oven and it's ready to go. What about wet weather, right? That's kind of the harder thing to do. Let me see if I can find my, here we go. Go back to my Excel file. So we'll cover this one semi-quickly. So here, if you see the orange, that's supposed to be indicative of a typical average daily flow. And you'll see in the next example a better way of doing this. But you can see what average daily flow would be if on this Wednesday in May there wasn't a fake rainfall event. And so here you can see this blue, and there's a lot of sociology behind how people act before, during, and after a larger rainfall event. But sufficient to say you can see that we went from 0.4 up to 1.3 or 1.4, so just a very rough 4 times multiplier on flow, so not a small event, not a giant event for this area. But what I'm going to do by way of doing a second dry weather pattern is try to estimate this by using a second pattern. So now this one may get a little confusing. Before I talked over and over again about having a unitless pattern where I want the average to be 1. Well, in this case, I'm actually adding flow, so I don't want the average to be 1. I don't want to take away dry weather flow from other parts of the day and make it happen at a certain time. I want to add extra flow on top of it. So I'm going to do that just through some simple arithmetic of subtracting what I expected there versus what's actually there to get this multiplier, which you see in gray. If you wanted to, you could add that as a direct time varying multiplier, or you could also normalize it. To be consistent in the approach, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend that approach, done the exact same thing before. So as you would expect, since we're adding this 0.7 on top of the 0.4, we have a higher gallons per capita per day. So what does that look like? Well, if I go back to my model, I've now in my scenario added a third one, which is wet weather. Turn off base because we know it's wrong. Again, we're kind of, you see we're getting further down in the scenarios where we don't want to make changes here in wet weather that are really changes that should exist in the base scenario. If I look at my comparison, I can see that dual point curve. This is only for one day I ran it, so you can see how it starts at the same, it diverges during the wet weather event, and it comes back and connects again. What does that look like on an individualized basis? Well, if I go into dry weather, and again, it's not necessarily dry weather. One second. Let me get my actual scenario, my wet weather scenario. I'll go to dry weather. I now have wet weather turned on. If I look at that, there's the 210. Again, this could be a direct flow. I don't have to add all this per capita, but I just did it to be consistent. So 210, same area, same density. That's not changing because it's raining. And then I have my actual pattern. Again, this is a Wednesday pattern, so I'm doing it only on Wednesday to show a specific example. And there's my hourly variations on that. So if I wanted to continue, I could do my, for instance, perhaps I wanted to show what this area looks like in a view like this. Well, this is something the model immediately allows you to do. This is that spatial extrapolation, or I can show model results in an area that I'm not metering by virtue of having well-metered data in one area. Similarly, if I wanted to take this normalized data and build on something in the future, I could do that too. But again, recall we did all this work on a rug, so it's kind of simplified by its definition. All right, so we're going to close that one out. That's the simple flow example, okay? Now notice one thing we didn't talk about, interestingly enough, is rainfall, right? Rainfall caused that to happen, but when you're using flow as a pattern, you don't really ever use that, which is one of its problems. So the next example is RTK. So here's a project, an actual project, oddly enough, down in the Southwest USA, and the demonstration here is to just show how to create and use RTK parameters. All right, and it's important, although we're only going to talk about one rainfall event, that RTK is rainfall specific. So if you have 10 rainfall events, you're going to have 10 potentially varying RTK values. So that's just an important side note. Okay, I made this one green so I wouldn't lose it. I'll zoom out here. You can see this kind of larger collection system. There's actually only one outfall. It's way up here. There's just a really big pump station down in the southeast, but in the northeast is where we outfall. That makes sense? So if you want to know, see, there's the aerial to kind of show you where we are. We're in the outlying systems here. So what I'm actually going to do is use the launch application part of XP Swim. I'm going to launch EPA SOAP. Drag this over. Now, if you haven't seen SOAP before, take a deep breath. I have probably more webinar talk than you want to hear about just EPA SOAP, and you can find that and make sure that's linked up in the notes from this webinar. They have like an hour and a half just on this product. And one of the reasons I did that is so I could jump right into actually looking at data and not have to go through how to do all this. So you're just going to have to go with me, and if you want to know more, we have a lot on how to actually get to where we are here. But you can see if I look at my utilities, I've got rainfall data. You can see the rainfall data here for the different rain gauges, and you can also see that I've already loaded this one with flow data. In fact, you can do some neat scatter graphing. So we'll be doing line 3, that's the southern line, and I'll show you the whole data range. and drag it over. You get kind of neat scatter graphing type things, flow versus depth if you have that. It's just inferring data that's already there. But for the purpose of this, we don't really care about that nearly as much as we care about our RDII graph. Again, we're going to go line 3, and SOAP likes putting that on a different window. Okay, so here is a lot of data, right? So let's turn some of this off because you don't need to see all of it. Turn off some of the individualized curves. And what we've got here is, yeah, this is where we'll start. And what you see here in green is actual flow. So this is flow happening. And this is the smarter way that EPA SOAP can do this than me just using a quick Excel. It's actually telling me what it thinks the RDII is. So the red here is just the RDII. So I'm going to go to event 1. So I switched over to event 1, which has added this little purple box to show you there's rainfall there. And now you see this line here. If you see that line there, that's my RTK derived values. So I'm going to turn off observe flow. So long and short of it is what we're trying to do is get our mustard colored line to look like the ketchup colored line there, and that's what we're trying to do. And here are my RTK values. As a quick review, R is fraction of rainfall, T is time to peak, K is lag time as a ratio for a short, medium, and long term. Those are 3 unit hydrographs that you add together to get 1 hydrograph. So, and there's initial abstraction, which is the concept of running a longer term event. It's turned off here. Because it's turned off here, you can see up here there's a little more rain, and I'm not getting a response because I'm only really looking at this first event here. So, but that's fine for the simplified example. What you can use SOAP for once you have everything in there is I can make actual changes. So you can imagine that a short term, so this is our inflow, if I tripled the rainfall, I'd expect my mustard colored line to get much bigger. And in fact, it does. So if I make it 0.15, it goes way up here. So I know that's not right. So I make a change to get it closer. Similarly, if you make changes, say you make the T really big here, well, the medium that should be down here just flattened out, right? So we don't really want that. And you can make changes in other places too, right? You can make that number really small, so the ratio on the long is way small. It makes changes. So I'm going to set that back the way it is because I like how close this is here. It gets everything. It doesn't cover this because it's looking at this rainfall here. I don't have abstractions. So you may say to yourself, and again, I know that's purposely quick, just in the interest of time, but just showing you how you can get RTK. There's certainly a lot of information that we have as free webinars you can watch that goes through exactly how to get to this point. But you may say, even at this point, there's 9 different equations or 9 different variables that I could change in any which way and probably get the same value, which is true. And if you go to our knowledge base, or you can do some searching and you can find it if you dig hard enough online, but if you go to our knowledge base, I have an article there telling you the preferred method for doing this. In other words, there is a standardized way of how you should change one before the next, et cetera, so you can feel confident that the way you approach it is going to be similar to someone in a different area. But remember our RT and K here. I'm going to take that and say goodbye to SOAP. And again, I should say that's only for 1 line and for 1 rainfall event. So if I went to a different event, I'd have different RTK numbers. It's up to you and your intuition to either pick the most appropriate one. There's some statistical analysis you can do in SOAP, and we cover in another webinar also. So there's different ways you can do that. But over inside XP Swim under global data, under rainfall, that's the rain. See, now we're introducing rainfall. So I actually have rainfall. So there's my line 3 rain gauge. I ran it for a shorter duration here, in interest of processing time. So I have actual rainfall, and you can see there's a lot of zeros, but there's actually rain through there. So that's great. So we're actually introducing rainfall. The other thing that's important here is the RDII. We go to RDII, which is a global data. That's a record that you can use over and over again. And there we are, RTK, no abstractions, using that rainfall again, the line 3 rainfall, and the same R, T, and K that we just developed in SOAP. So we're feeling pretty good about the way that the SOAP was calibrated because we made the changes. And now we need to take it over here and do the final bit of work. I'm now in runoff mode. The other thing you may not have noticed in my first example is everything lived in hydraulics. We're in runoff now. I'm going to randomly pick a node and show you what that may look like. If you're not familiar with runoff mode, don't use it that much. There's a sub-catchment. We're going to skip over that and cover that in the next example. We're interested in this RDII. So again, I just clicked on subcatchment. I'm in this single subcatchment, and I have an RDII. Notice I could have many RDIIs for different subcatchments. I'm picking this one, and I'm using a different sewer shed area. So the fact that my subcatchment said 5 acres is something that the model is going to disregard. It's going to use 113 acres. So that's the area part. We had that same area in the dry weather flow pattern. Now I have my global database of RDII. Same thing we saw before, right? Same RTK as before. So that has the RTK and the rainfall. So now we can load that. We also, in this event, have actual dry weather flow data that lives in hydraulics. And notice in runoff, all we're doing is applying the data at the nodes, and then that data is automatically carried over in a hydraulics. And what we can do is go down to our, in this case, is the one node we're looking at, and I didn't run it long. It looks like I didn't run the model long enough, unfortunately. Apologize for that, but you can see the pattern here. We're capturing the pattern. We haven't quite hit one of the peaks, but same idea. And we know that we're going to be relatively close calibrated because we use the RTK from SOAP. So that's kind of an RTK example. And again, I can go in and have dry weather flow that operates independently. In this case, it is just direct flow, right? So it's just a direct flow, 0.022 million gallons per day with a different dry weather pattern variation. This time, instead of having a second pattern that's kind of wet weather but not related to wet weather, I have something related to rainfall itself. Okay, we're doing okay on time. Final example. So we're kind of running backwards up the ladder. We did flow, and then we did RTK, and now we're going to do hydrology. After a sip of coffee. So hydrology example, project summary, we're going to switch gears, and we have a medium separate sanitary sewer system in the northeast of the U.S. Demonstration goal here is to show you how you can interface runoff in hydraulics. And we'll be doing that using interface files. Let's click on the demo and fire it up. Okay, now we're in runoff mode, and if I zoom out, you can kind of see down here this little red line dot here is where we'll be looking at when we get into hydraulics. So when we go to calibrate, we'll be looking over here. We're in runoff, and now we actually even have this catchment, which is nice. I have a catchment area draining right here. I'm going to double click, and now we'll spend a little more time on subcatchments. Remember on RTK, I jumped right through this because we weren't as interested. Now we are strictly talking hydrology. So now we are really trying to determine how the water falls out of the sky, how it's routed. We can do a lot of really complex work. And of course, there's some level of calibration just determining what type of method should I use. So let's look at this first. Now there's two subcatchments here, even though they drain together. So this first one is slightly larger, okay? And you can see we're using SCS hydrology. So a lot of you may be familiar with that. That's just using a curve number and a time of concentration. There's some other, if you want to do some changes to your initial abstraction and some other changes to the shape of the hydrograph, but generally speaking, one of the more approachable hydrology methods, because you really only need a couple of things, right? You can estimate the time of concentration and estimate a curve number. In this case, it's a bigger area, a low curve number, high time of concentration. That means is this is a slow response, right? The hydrograph generated by a low curve number and a high concentration is typically going to be fatter and longer. So this would indicate a longer response, maybe something like an infiltration. And notice here we have a smaller one. It's area of 10. And if we go to the SCS, you can see a higher curve number, and this is just the pervious curve number area, and then a time concentration much lower. So this is our short response. This is more indicative of inflow. So notice even though we are talking hydrology, we can still represent the short and longer term responses that we'd expect to see by changing methods. So it's kind of nice. Sometimes people assume that all you can do is route in one hydrograph and just hope for the best, but you can actually fine-tune that a little bit more. And of course, there are other changes you can make. You could choose to have infiltration of groundwater, and we talked about a little bit about that. Unfortunately, just in the interest of time, I don't have an example that also covers groundwater. Notice again, where does rain come in? In this case, rainfall comes in and it's loaded directly in the subcatchment. So similar to the last one, I have a constant time interval and I have all my rainfall here. So again, just like the RTK method, hydrology method, as you'd expect, takes real rainfall data. So I will produce real flow results from that rainfall data. Right? I'll get actual data. So here is in runoff mode my hydrograph. So you can see my little dual peaks here. I got a quick one and a larger one here, slightly pulled back, and that's what you expect from two different subcatchments draining together. If I run over to hydraulics, and I'll zoom in at the same node here, you see here time series inflows. I've got dry weather, just like I'd have before in my last example, and again, it's a direct flow with a temporal variation. This has nothing to do with rainfall. It's just my dry weather, the first thing I would do. And notice here it's kind of small, but I'm using interface flow, which is telling the model that all that work we just did on hydrology, setting up two catchments, defining the curve number, the initial abstraction, the time of concentration, all that work, I want to take 30% of that, and I want to go ahead and connect that in to the sanitary system. Of course, it's not directly connected. It's not like there's a grate out in the real world, but it's taking that 30% and putting it in. So you have the calibration of trying to make sure that your hydrology is accurate, and then you have this translation, if you will, of how much of that flow, the magnitude of flow I want to connect. And so in this case, let me get out and zoom in where I mentioned before. And I'm down here, and this is where I'm going to be metering, and I'll bring over same idea as before, where I've got actual meter data here, right? So I got velocity, got my elevation, flow, same idea. In this case, there is, 5,000 records of data. And because I have 5,000 records of data, if I actually go and look at this pipe 5445, under gauge data, which is right there, I have gauge flow. Gauge flow is telling it, and this is the same as what we did in the RTK example before, I just didn't show you. It's saying, go to my desktop and find that file we just showed, which I need to make sure I close, or XPSwim's not going to like it. Okay, let me go back to where I was. There it is there, and then I can pick a station if I need to. There are some standard formats that you can use, and if not, in our example, we went one further and we actually define a flow meter. So in this case, you can see we can even skip fields. So we said, oh, it's a CSV, there's a header line, skip that first column, date, time, velocity, elevation, skip that column and flow. And that just tells it exactly how to read it, which means if I hit the, I think I still have it open. Yeah, hold on just a second. It wants me to, I don't want to save it. All right. It's all about permissions. Life is about permissions. So now if I do open it, I can see everything. There's all the data, right? So which is the easiest way for me to calibrate. So now I've got the real data, right? Again, way at the beginning, we want to calibrate against real data. Well, now I got my real data. I got what I wanted. So if I go back here, F7 is my hotkey to show results. And you can see, look at that. We have our data over time. Is it going to be perfect? Of course not. We're not trying to get it to be exact for Wednesday, October 8th, because that means it's going to be wrong for Thursday, October 9th. But we want it to be really well in other ways. So here you can see, all right, what do we want? Now we see our first jump. All right, here's a rainfall event. So if we're using a dry weather flow and wet weather flow pattern, it would just blaze right through that. It wouldn't know what happened. Here we get a really good match here. We don't have any kind of reduction like we have in the gauge data, and then so when the next event hit, it jumps up. See the same thing here, right? The reduction is lower and slower than we'd expect down here. So we can do a little work if we wanted to adjust that. If one of our calibration goals was multiple storms, we certainly want to adjust that. If our calibration goal is just hitting one major storm, then we probably don't need to adjust it as much. Now I'm going to zoom in here as a precursor to the next webinar. Right, you see all these jagged lines everywhere, and most of the data is in our input data. I can tell you it's hourly data, right? So why do we have these jagged lines? Looks like an EKG here for hourly data that's supposed to be nice and smooth. My first couple examples look kind of smooth. What's happening here? Well, this model has pumps in it, so those are cycles of pumps, right? So we have a lot of pump action, and that has an impact, and making sure you get the pump correct is something worth doing, right? We want to make sure. So here's our pump, and you can see it's shooting up all over the place, on, off, on, off, on, off. And I can tell you from experience and through theory that the way the model shows that and what happens in the field should be very similar, but can often vary greatly for some very small reasons. That's my precursor to talking about pumps, which is our next webinar, to tie it all together. So there's this example, again, kind of briefly showing you where you would calibrate and how you'd build a model. All right. We're still good. So in summary, just like before with wet weather, there's certainly different methods out there, right? There's different methods to try to show the model how the real world exists, and so as you imagine, there's different solutions for those problems. And hopefully this gives you some good content on approaches. Certainly your project is going to be unique, and there may be some complexities there that we didn't cover. By all means, ask a question or shoot me an email if you want to talk about those in more detail. We have our support portal and knowledge base articles to cover some of those more edge cases that do come up from time to time. And like I said, pumps is coming up next. That's the last, like, really well defined. We're going to do that. So if there's anything else, even if you say, no, the last webinar should just be more examples, then we will totally head that route. So with that, hopefully you've been asking questions and wearing out our support engineers during the last hour or so. So I appreciate your time. Hope you learned something, and I will talk to you later.